Welcome to a new class. I'm Julia and today we're gonna talk about shutter speed and movement. Let's get started. Shutter speed is one of the three pillars of exposure alongside aperture and ISO. It has two functions. It changes the exposure of your photos and also it conveys movement in an image by either freezing the action or blurring motion. This is another one of those super fun creative applications of shutter speed, and I am super excited to talk to you about it. So in the example on the left, I was able to freeze the action, this beautiful, sexy pour, by using a fast shutter speed. In the example in the middle, I was able to capture movement, so this slow and sexy sprinkle of cocoa powder by using a slow shutter speed. And in the example on the right, I was able to freeze the action not by using shutter speed, but by using flash and a fixed shutter speed. If this is a little confusing, don't worry, we're gonna dive into it in more details. So what is shutter speed? As the name suggests, it's the speed of the shutter. Thanks, Captain Obvious. What I mean by that is, what is the shutter? So the shutter is like a curtain in front of our sensor. The shutter is made out of two curtains, the rear curtain and the front curtain. So let me explain to you how the shutter works. If, for example, we take my face is the sensor. In front of the sensor, there is a rear curtain and a front curtain. So the shutter starts and it's closed, obviously, right? Because the light is not coming in. What happens is the rear curtain drops down and exposes the sensor. So it literally opens the sensor to let light in. And then as after a certain amount of seconds or a certain amount of time, the front curtain drops down, closing the shutter, closing the sensor again, and stopping the exposure. Okay, that's how the shutter works. Now, the speed at which these two curtains open and closes, it's the shutter speed. The shutter speed is measured in seconds, or more likely in fractions of seconds, because this whole thing that I did with my face, it happens super fast. Like I'm talking like Roadrunner fast. Some cameras have shutter speeds that get to 1/8,000 of a second. It's so fast that personally I can't even imagine it. So oftentimes the shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds. And as I said, the shutter speed tells you how long the curtain is open for, which means it controls how much light comes into the sensor. How do you set the shutter speed on your camera? So you can set it in shutter priority mode, because obviously shutter priority mode, you set the shutter speed that you want and the ISO that you want, and the camera will automatically set the right aperture to achieve the correct exposure for that scene. Or you can set it in manual mode, where you have full control over all of your exposure settings. So you can set your shutter speed, you can set your aperture and your ISO to control the exposure. On most cameras, for a lack of space in the display, the shutter speed is not shown as a fraction. So you won't see 1/8. You will only see the number 8. But the number 8 or 16 or 250 or whatever number you see, that is generally the fraction. So it means if you see 250, you're not shooting at 250 seconds, you're shooting at 1/250th of a second. So that is a fraction of a second. If you see the number with the quotation marks, that actually means 8 seconds or 16 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever, okay? many cameras will not allow you to shoot above 30 seconds, so that will be their maximum, their longest shutter speed. So you will see 30 and then the two little quotation marks. So that's how you will see it on your camera display. So as we mentioned, shutter speed changes the overall exposure of our images, meaning if you leave the aperture and the ISO constant, by changing the shutter speed, you will change the overall exposure. So if you use a slower shutter speed, so a lower number on your camera display, what you're doing is, because the curtains open and close more slowly, more light has time to hit the sensor. So the sensor is exposed for more time, meaning it can capture more light. If you have a faster shutter speed, however, again, remember the shutter speed can move really fast. So if it moves, the faster it moves, the less light is able to reach the sensor. So we will have a darker exposure overall. Now, another important thing that the shutter does is it can capture or freeze movement. This is very important if you want to have sharp photos. So the shutter speed is responsible for freezing the action or emphasizing movement. You can freeze the action with a fast shutter speed, and I have another class on this, just like how to capture movement and freeze the action, so check that out. With a slower shutter speed, what you can do is emphasize the movement instead. When you use slower shutter speeds, you have to be really careful not to have camera blur, because if you have camera blur, means your picture is all blurry and it's unrecoverable. You cannot save a picture that has camera blur. So shutter speed is a really important setting to master if you want to make sure that your photos are sharp. And in food photography, often we use a tripod for this very purpose, so that we can make sure that even if we use slow shutter speeds, our photos will be sharp. Why do we need to use slow shutter speeds? Sometimes it's because when you shoot in natural light and you don't have enough light coming in from your window, you need to increase your exposure without touching the other two settings. And we have a class on the exposure triangle, so you will know why you shouldn't touch the other settings. So in food photography, often we use a tripod so that we can set our shutter speed as slow as needed to achieve the right exposure without incurring in camera blur. This is a visual example of motion blur and how to freeze the action. So with a slower shutter speed, here I was shooting at 1/80th of a second, I was able to show the motion of those beautiful cheese flakes falling down on my pasta. And as you can see, my image is sharp and completely still because I was shooting on a tripod. So I didn't have camera blur here. I only had motion blur from my moving subjects, basically. So from the fact that the cheese flakes are falling, and they're falling faster than an 80th of a second, which means they look blurry. But everything else in my image is sharp. This helps in terms of storytelling to convey the fact that these guys are falling on my pasta. So it adds that little bit of extra niceness to my story. In the example on the right, I used a very fast shutter speed, 1/1600 of a second, so bam, super fast. And I was able to freeze the motion. So this pizza maker, he's like just literally throwing pizza in the air, and I was able to freeze that motion. So the pizza is perfectly still, despite the fact that obviously in real life it was moving really fast. So, as I mentioned, in food photography, often we use a tripod. Why do we use a tripod and why is that important? So, sometimes natural light is not strong enough to allow us to have a good and bright exposure. So by using a tripod, we don't have to worry about our shutter speed, meaning we can compensate the lack of light by using a slow shutter speed. And that allows us to keep our ISO low. Have a look at the class on ISO and noise so that you understand perfectly why it's important to keep your ISO low. Keeping your ISO low ensures that you have no grain, no noise, and the best image quality. So it's important to keep your ISO low. You don't have to worry about camera shake if you're on a tripod, because obviously your camera is pretty stable there. And because you don't have to worry about camera shake and you can set your shutter speed to a very slow shutter speed to let more light in, you can use whatever aperture you want for your storytelling, for your subject. Again, have a look at the class on aperture to see why and how to use which aperture. So what if you don't have a tripod? This is the $1,000,000 question. How to avoid camera shake and camera blur if you're shooting without a tripod? Now, obviously, having a tripod is always the best solution, but sometimes maybe you're, in the spur of a moment, you're in a restaurant, you're on location, or you just want to be a little bit more creative with your photography, then you might want to shoot handheld. How do you avoid camera shake? Because as we mentioned, if you have camera shake, you can take your photo, throw it in the bin because it's not recoverable. So, as a rule of thumb, in order not to get camera shake, you have to use a fraction with a number that is the same number as the focal length of your lens. So, for example, if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, then your focal length will be 50. If you're shooting with 100, then your focal length will be 100. So far, pretty straightforward. Now, you always have to shoot with 1 over the focal length number rounded up. And this is different from full frame and cropped sensor cameras. So to give you an example and make it clearer, if you're shooting with a 50mm without a tripod, you have a full frame camera, you have to shoot at least 1/50th of a second, at least. So that needs to be the slowest shutter that you can use is 1/50th of a second. If you use 1/25th of a second, that is too slow. You are going to get camera blur. If you use 1/200th of a second, then it's still good. So anything faster than 1 over the number of your focal length. And this changes for cropped sensor cameras because obviously the sensor is smaller, so there is the multiplying factor for your focal length. So, for example, Nikon cameras have a multiplying factor of 1.5. So if I'm shooting with a 50mm lens, that the equivalent of a 50mm lens is a 75mm lens on a cropped sensor camera. Just trust me on this. You don't need to do the math really, which means that you need to shoot round it up. So there is no shutter speed that is 1/75th of a second. So round it up to 1/80th of a second and faster, obviously. So 1/200, 1,000, etc., etc. It also depends on how shaky your hands are, but this is a golden rule. So to start, if you're shooting handheld, set your shutter speed to these values and faster. This is the slowest shutter speed you can use if you shoot unheld. If you're shooting with 100 millimeters, then obviously your slowest shutter speed is not 1/50th anymore. It becomes 1/100. So the more zoomed in you are and the longer your focal length, the faster shutter speed you have to have in order to avoid camera blur. That is why it's really important to shoot on a tripod, because obviously if you're shooting with a 50 millimeter and you can only use a shutter speed as slow as 1/50th of a second, you might not be letting enough light in. So you will have to compromise by either increasing your ISO or opening your aperture. And sometimes that's not ideal, because obviously higher ISO means more noise. Have a look at the class where I explain this in more detail. But in order not to get camera shake, this is the rule of thumb. What about shutter speed and flash? So this is one of the reasons why I love flash so much. So if you shoot with flash, basically your shutter speed is not relevant anymore to any of this. You don't risk camera shake, you don't risk motion blur, none of that stuff. So it's very easy to set your shutter speed with a flash, because your flash will tell you exactly what shutter speed you need to use. And that shutter speed is called flash sync speed. And it's generally for almost every flash is around 1/60th to 1/250th of a second. So anything between those numbers, that's your shutter speed. It never changes. Keep it that. So it's pretty easy. And that's because the burst of the flash is faster than any shutter speed. So the burst of the flash actually becomes your shutter speed. I do explain this in more detail in my classes on flash, so do check that out. But this is just like a refresher, like just to plant that seed in you and like make you understand that shutter speed and flash is a different concept than shutter speed with natural light. So, to recap shutter speed, here's a little cheat sheet for you. Shutter speed measures how fast or how slow the shutter curtain opens and closes to let the light in. Since it's measured in fractions of a second, a smaller number is slower, while a higher number is faster. Now, if we have a small number, so a slow shutter speed, we let in more light, because obviously the sensor is exposed for a longer period of time, so it can record more light. That also means that if the shutter is slow and it's open for a longer time, we risk having motion blur and camera shake. So you need to make sure that the camera is on a tripod if you're using a slow shutter speed to let in more light. On the other hand, if we have a fast shutter speed, so a high number, the shutter opens and closes a lot faster. So the sensor is exposed to light for a shorter period of time, which means less light can come in and is recorded by the sensor. That also means that with a fast shutter speed, you can freeze motion and you don't risk camera shake. So your image will be sharper. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ciao!